When my mom blamed me for her debt, I showed her the bank statements. I flew my entire family to Hawaii for my wedding. First class. 5-star accommodations. I spent $32,000 thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd finally be proud of me. They used the money for a European vacation with my sister instead. My name is Sophia. I'm 32. I work in investment banking in Manhattan, and I've learned to operate with a certain level of emotional detachment, especially when it comes to my family. But nothing prepared me for the text that came weeks before my wedding: "You're not worth seeing in a wedding dress." That sentence rewrote everything I thought I knew about obligation, about family, and about what it means to be unwanted. I was sitting in my office, overlooking the city, when it came through. One minute I was reviewing a client's portfolio, meticulously analyzing risk, and the next, I was just staring at that message. Blank. Cold. My mother had sent it. Casually, as if we were discussing weather. She didn't even say it out of anger. That would have made more sense. There was no storm, no fight. Just that flat, effortless cruelty, like the kind you only get from someone who has rehearsed disappointment in you for decades. I don't even remember the first thing I did afterward. Maybe I laughed. Maybe I cried. I think I just closed my laptop and sat there, listening to the faint hum of the espresso machine in the break room. It was the culmination of something that had been brewing since I was a child in Milwaukee, something I had been taught to call love, but was never quite convinced by. Growing up, there was always my younger sister, Heather. And then there was me. Heather was loud, blonde, effortlessly lovable. The kind of girl who made messes and got applause for it. She played soccer. She smiled at cameras. She made people feel needed. I got straight A's. I read quietly in my room. I wanted them to notice, to ask me questions, to come to my spelling bees and award ceremonies. But Heather had soccer practice. Always soccer practice. I remember being 10, holding a trophy bigger than my arms could wrap around, and walking into the house alone. They hadn't come. My principal had driven me home because no one else had. That was the night my mom told me to put that somewhere it won't collect dust. And then they took Heather out for ice cream, for a goal she scored at practice. I knew even then I was not the favorite. But I also knew, deep down, that I could outgrow the part of me that needed their applause. So I did. I left for Northwestern on a full scholarship. I stayed gone for most holidays. I stopped giving them the chance to disappoint me. And when I met Nathan, smart, kind, driven, he didn't flinch at my ambition. He didn't tell me I was too much. He held space for all the sharpness I'd honed into strength over the years. We got engaged in early spring. He wanted a wedding in New York. I wanted something quieter. Something that didn't echo with judgment. So we chose Maui. A small ceremony, ocean in the background, limited guests. I told my parents I would cover the costs if they agreed to come. Flights. Hotels. Even Heather's husband and their 2 kids. My mom said, "Well, I suppose if it's all paid for." I sent them the confirmation emails. They never booked the flights. They took the money. Bought a luxury tour package. Heather posted photos from Santorini a week before my wedding. That's when I asked my mother, point blank, where they were. That's when she sent me that text. "You're not worth seeing in a wedding dress." That was the moment I stopped believing in blood as bond. But I didn't cancel the wedding. And I didn't cry in front of anyone, not even Nathan. I smiled through the ceremony. I kissed my husband under the banyan tree. And then, quietly, I began to dismantle the idea that I owed them anything at all. Because what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I'd kept the receipts. Every transfer. Every transaction. Every cent that went from my account to theirs. And I knew exactly when I would use them. Not out of revenge. Out of necessity. Out of something sharper. A kind of closure they wouldn't see coming. They didn't even ask if I was happy. No one in my family reached out after the wedding. Not to apologize. Not to pretend. Just silence, like I'd vanished from their idea of what family should be. But that wasn't new. Nathan and I returned from Hawaii quietly. We unpacked our bags. Folded the embroidered napkins I'd insisted on bringing back. He brewed tea while I sat on the floor with my laptop, pulling up old email chains. The spreadsheet I opened had been growing for years. Every wire transfer. Every check written in my name. Every surprise expense I'd absorbed under the polite language of family needs. At the top of the document, in bold, I'd titled it, Emotional Overdraft Ledger. It was never meant to be weaponized. Just, remembered. I needed a record of the times I gave, and what I was expected to pretend didn't cost me. Nathan sat across from me at the dining table, the soft click of his spoon stirring honey into his cup. He didn't ask what I was doing. He already knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the slow pulse of Manhattan outside our window. Car horns far off. Someone shouting a name in the street. And beneath it, the sound I'd heard since childhood, the dull ache of being forgotten. It was different now, though. Now I had something they wanted. Now, I had proof. Not of theft. That would have been cleaner. But of neglect that cost something real. Financially. Emotionally. Legally. I started with the wedding receipts. The travel agency confirmed the refunded ticket amounts, processed quietly the week after I sent payment. They hadn't even bothered to hide it. My sister Heather had upgraded her room in Santorini to a suite with a private balcony. The concierge had confirmed it when I called. My mother's credit card didn't cover the difference. Mine had. They used my gift to fund someone else's view. My next step wasn't impulsive. I didn't throw a fit or call them screaming. I just opened a drawer and pulled out the file folder labeled Family Trust, pending. Grandfather Hamilton had left behind a small portfolio, nothing extravagant, just a couple of mid-tier properties and municipal bonds. My name was listed as successor trustee. I'd never activated the role because my father insisted it wasn't necessary. "We'll handle it privately," he said when the estate attorney contacted us 2 years ago. I'd let it go. Back then, I still thought trust meant something. But now? Now I contacted the estate attorney myself. I said, I'm ready to assume full management. There have been financial irregularities. He didn't ask for details. Just send over the documents and scheduled a review. I stayed up past midnight signing my name in blue ink across dotted lines. Control shifted that quietly. The next day at work, I kept my head down. In investment banking, we don't bring personal drama to the table. No one wants to know what's bleeding under your blazer. I analyzed risk reports. Smiled in meetings. Helped a junior associate clean up a messed up presentation deck. But when I got home, I sent an email to my mother. Short. Polite. Please expect a formal accounting review of the funds you received in relation to our wedding travel. A reconciliation is required for tax purposes. I'll forward the itemized statement by end of week. I didn't wait for a reply. And none came. Instead, Heather called me that weekend. First time in months. She said, "You're making a big deal out of nothing." It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't answer right away. I was folding laundry, the scent of lavender detergent rising from the warm clothes. Nathan had gone to the gym. The apartment was quiet. I said, "You took money meant for my wedding and used it for a vacation." She exhaled, all irritation. I could hear children in the background. Her perfect life continuing. She said, "You can afford it." God, Sophia. You've always made everything about punishment. It was always this way. I was too serious. Too successful. Too inflexible. But they'd never seen how hard I worked to earn the independence they took for granted. Or how carefully I'd rationed out forgiveness until it ran dry. I ended the call without arguing. And then I did something I'd been avoiding for years. I requested a credit report under my mother's name. She'd used my social security number once before, back when I was in college, to secure a short-term loan for medical expenses. At least, that's what she claimed. She said it was harmless. That she didn't want to burden me. I believed her. But now, I just wanted to know. The report came in 2 days later. My name wasn't on anything new. But the timing of that loan? It didn't match the medical emergency she mentioned. It matched a purchase date on Heather's new SUV. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing. Not rage. Not sadness. Just clarity. They had never borrowed from me. They had simply taken. And now, I had everything I needed to decide what would come next. But what surprised me most was how quiet it all felt. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the truth to mean something for once. I opened the bank statement from 2 months ago, highlighted every transaction tied to my mother's card that traced back to accounts I controlled. Every debt she'd passed off as just a little help. Every lie she'd framed as a necessary sacrifice. I packaged the documentation neatly. And then I began to write a letter. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just honest. Not to them. But to the financial institution where she'd co-signed on a property 5 years ago. Because it was time they knew who really made the payments. And it was time for her to feel what accountability actually looked like. I printed it out. Folded it carefully. Slipped it into a blue envelope. Then I placed it on the table beside my wedding photo. In it, Nathan was holding my hand beneath the banyan tree, eyes soft, sunlight breaking behind us. That day wasn't ruined. Not by them. But I'd been lying to myself thinking it was only the past I needed to walk away from. It was something else entirely. And I wasn't done yet. Not even close. There's a specific kind of silence that comes after betrayal. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of illusion. For weeks after I sent the documentation, I heard nothing from them. No calls. No apologies. Not even an insult disguised as concern. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was strategic. That's how I knew they were planning something. Heather was never one for silence. She fought with theatrics. My mother, on the other hand, fought with manipulation, withdrawal, guilt, selective forgetting. And when those tactics stopped working, she changed the game entirely. The email came on a Thursday afternoon. Subject line, urgent, family matter. It was short, almost suspiciously polite. My father's name was copied. So was a family friend, a real estate attorney my parents had once leaned on during the sale of their lake house. The message requested a meeting. In person. No explanation. Just a time, a date, and a location, my childhood home. I read it 3 times. It felt like a setup, but I went anyway. Not out of curiosity. Out of necessity. Nathan offered to come with me. He stood in the kitchen with his coffee, leaning against the counter in that calm way of his, waiting for me to say yes. He said, "You shouldn't go alone." I replied, "I won't be alone." He didn't press. Just kissed my temple and handed me the keys to the car we shared. I drove north in silence, past neighborhoods I once memorized from the back seat of my parents' minivan. The trees still arched over the roads like old secrets. Every streetlight, every cracked sidewalk, reminded me of who I used to be. When I pulled into the driveway, there were already 3 cars out front. Their Lexus. Heather's SUV. And one I didn't recognize, sleek, black, and deliberately intimidating. I walked in without knocking. The smell hit me first, lavender cleaning spray and something artificial, like fear disguised as hospitality. My mother stood in the foyer, wearing a pearl necklace I hadn't seen in years. She smiled like nothing had happened. My father looked up from the dining table. Heather was perched beside him, arms crossed, lips tight. Across from them sat a man in a navy suit. My mother said, "Sophia, this is Gregory. He's here to mediate." The word lingered. Mediate. As if this were a negotiation between equals. I sat down without responding. Folded my hands. Waited. Gregory spoke first, introducing himself as a consultant. Not quite a lawyer, not quite a mediator, something in between. He began referencing documents I hadn't seen, numbers that didn't add up, accusations wrapped in language too polite to be honest. They claimed I'd mishandled funds. That the money I sent was not a gift but a shared asset. That since I hadn't provided a formal gift letter, they were entitled to dispute the charges. They weren't talking about reimbursement anymore. They were talking about ownership. I listened in stillness, my fingers pressed against the polished wood of the table, absorbing every word without reacting. They'd prepared for this. My mother handed over a binder. Inside were copies of receipts, carefully selected to tell a version of the story where they were the victims of my ambition, framed as neglect. I felt something in me shift. Not anger. Focus. They thought I'd fight this emotionally. That I'd yell or cry or beg. They didn't understand the math. I reached into my bag, pulled out my own folder. Thicker. Heavier. Meticulously dated and indexed. I said, "I'd like to submit a counter-narrative." Gregory blinked. My mother's mouth tightened. I slid the folder across the table. Inside were notarized affidavits from the bank confirming the original ticket refunds. Statements from the travel agency, email chains with timestamps, proof of diverted funds. There was also a letter from my grandfather's estate attorney verifying my current role as trustee, along with a summary of financial distributions I had authority over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten them. I just explained. And the longer I spoke, the quieter they became. By the end, Heather had gone pale. My father looked at the floor. My mother sat frozen, hands clenched in her lap. Gregory closed the folder slowly. He said, "I think we'll need to reschedule." I stood and left without looking back. Outside, the air smelled like grass and rain. I didn't cry until I reached the car. Not for them. For myself. For the version of me that once thought they would love her, if only she gave enough. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel, breathed through the sting in my throat, and let the tears come quietly. Then I wiped them away and started the engine. By the time I pulled into our garage in the city, I'd made a decision. It wasn't enough to protect myself. I had to cut them off completely. Emotionally. Legally. Financially. That night, I sat on the floor with a glass of wine and began drafting formal revocation notices. They'd no longer have access to any residual accounts or pending disbursements. I updated my legal documents, removed them as emergency contacts, revoked every informal power they'd once held. It wasn't revenge. It was math. And survival. 2 days later, Nathan and I were having coffee on the balcony when my phone buzzed. A text. From Heather. Just 2 words. "You'll regret this." I stared at the screen. Then I smiled, set the phone down, and sipped my coffee. Because for the first time in my life, I wouldn't. There's a quiet violence in being gaslit by your own family. Not in the words, they rarely come with shouting, but in the manipulation behind the silences, the omissions, the twisted versions of reality they try to feed you, one spoonful at a time. But I wasn't hungry anymore. After Heather's message, I waited. Not out of fear, out of curiosity. I wanted to see how quickly they'd escalate once they realized I wasn't coming back. It didn't take long. 3 days later, a notice arrived at my office. A formal inquiry, thinly veiled as a financial dispute, filed through my firm's compliance department. It claimed I'd leveraged insider information to misallocate family assets. There were no specifics. Just a smear of vague allegations dressed up in legalese, clearly designed to rattle my position. My firm took it seriously. Of course they did. Reputation in finance is everything. Even a whisper can spiral. But I'd seen this before. Just never this close. I spent the rest of the day assembling a digital archive, every document, every timestamp, every email and signature proving the separation between my work and personal accounts. I wasn't just clean. I was meticulous. Still, the damage wasn't the point. They didn't need to win. They just needed to make me feel like I was slipping. And in the weeks that followed, the pressure didn't stop, it just changed shape. Phone calls from unknown numbers. A voicemail from my mother's voice, soft, rehearsed. "We're just trying to get some clarity, Sophia. This isn't personal. Heather, again, you're making this worse than it needs to be." My father didn't call. But I heard from his attorney. A formal request to revisit a financial gift he'd once sent me after college graduation, a $5,000 check I hadn't even cashed until months later. They were attempting to reframe it as part of an informal family agreement, suggesting I'd misrepresented its nature. I sent a 2-line response. All documentation has been reviewed by my counsel. No further action required. There was no counsel. Not yet. But I let them assume. Because sometimes power is about what you don't clarify. Nathan watched it all unfold with that quiet steadiness he carried like armor. He never offered cheap sympathy. Never said "I'm sorry" like it would fix things. He just kept showing up. Quiet breakfasts. Late night walks. Shoulder touches that said, "I see you, and I know you're holding more than you should have to." He said, "What do you need?" I didn't know how to answer that for a long time. Because what I needed wasn't advice. It was a strategy. I started small. I reviewed the trust portfolio my grandfather had left behind. Not just the documents, everything. Every property. Every tenant. Every clause in the trust that could be interpreted or misused. And I found something. A clause in the original deed to a small rental property outside Milwaukee, one my father had been managing quietly, long before I took over the trust. The property was held in the family's name, but the deed hadn't been updated in over 15 years. On paper, it was still under my grandfather's name, with my father listed only as a temporary caretaker. That meant, under current management rules, it defaulted to me as trustee. It wasn't much. A duplex. Maybe $300,000 in value. But it was leverage. And I knew exactly who was renting it, a close family friend of my mother's. Someone who had no idea she wasn't actually paying my parents, but should have been paying the trust directly. I made one phone call. Calm. Professional. The tenant was cooperative. Confused, but polite. I requested records of payments, 10 years' worth. When she sent them, I saw it clearly. Over $80,000 in rent, deposited into an account I didn't control. Diverted funds. I filed a quiet, internal claim with the estate's Financial Oversight Board. No lawsuits. No threats. Just a formal report of breach of fiduciary duty. I knew they'd find it. And they did. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from my father's lawyer. It was short. They offered to settle. Privately. Quietly. No apology. No admission of wrongdoing. Just a check. I didn't cash it. I wasn't after money. I was after something else. On the surface, I lived like nothing had changed. I worked. I smiled. I met deadlines. My world remained professional, efficient, intact. But privately, I built walls. I contacted a trust specialist. Opened a new set of accounts in a financial institution none of my family had ever used. Redrafted my will. Established a clause ensuring no member of my immediate family, by blood or marriage, could contest my estate or access any residual benefit without a notarized affidavit of contribution. I left nothing open. I closed the vault. Nathan came home late one evening to find me on the balcony, barefoot, hair damp from the shower, staring out at the city like it owed me something. He said, "You look tired." I replied, "I'm done." He didn't ask what that meant. He just nodded and stepped behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. It felt like stillness. Like relief I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. But I wasn't really done. Not yet. Because a week later, I received an email from the Financial Advisory Board overseeing trust compliance. They'd flagged my report. And they'd opened a full investigation. Which meant the next knock on their door wouldn't be mine. It would be an auditor. You don't really understand power until you watch someone lose the illusion of it, slowly, then all at once. The audit was real. Silent, methodical, and far more invasive than I think they expected. It started discreetly, an official request for transaction histories, property statements, lease records. Then came the interview requests, first to me, then to them. I wasn't privy to everything the auditors discovered, but I didn't need to be. My mother's silence was the first red flag. She didn't try to reach out. Not even to lie. Heather, on the other hand, began unraveling publicly. She posted vague, manicured outrage on social media, passive-aggressive quotes about betrayal, thinly veiled swipes about selfish women who weaponize success. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so pitiful. People noticed. Old family acquaintances started calling. Not to gossip. To ask questions. Questions I had no interest in answering. I stayed quiet. Professional. Controlled. But I knew the confrontation would come eventually. And it did. A formal request came from the trust board, asking me to attend a joint mediation meeting with all involved parties. Not for resolution, they were clear on that. This was procedural. A final, documented conversation before decisions about penalties and reassignments would be made. I had the option to decline. But I said yes. Nathan insisted on driving me. He didn't park near the building. Just waited in a coffee shop across the street, phone on, eyes open, shoulders tense in that way he rarely allowed himself to be. The meeting was held in a downtown office suite, neutral, sleek, windowless. The kind of place designed to extract emotion from a room before a word is spoken. I arrived 10 minutes early. They were already there. My father sat with his hands clasped, knuckles pale. My mother wore one of her statement scarves, burgundy silk, trembling at her throat. Heather was there too, in designer sunglasses she didn't remove the entire time. I walked in without hesitation and took the empty seat. The mediator, a woman named Claire, welcomed everyone calmly. She laid out the rules. No interruptions. No raised voices. Everything recorded. And then she asked me to begin. I spoke clearly. Evenly. I stated the facts. Provided a brief summary of the documented financial discrepancies, and the findings from the audit that confirmed multiple violations of trust protocols, including unauthorized fund transfers, mismanagement of rental property revenue, and falsified maintenance reports. I used no adjectives. No emotion. Just numbers. When I finished, Claire turned to them. My father spoke first. He said, "We didn't intend harm. We were managing things as they always had been." I replied, "Intent doesn't negate misappropriation." He looked away. My mother started to speak, but her voice broke. Not out of sorrow. Out of frustration. Her performance was tired. She said, "We're family, Sophia." I replied, "Exactly." Heather finally spoke. She said, "You're punishing us for not clapping every time you breathe." I said nothing. She leaned forward. She said, "You're not better than us." I looked her in the eye. I replied, "No. Just quieter." Claire moved things forward. She summarized the next steps. Penalties would be determined based on the audit's findings. The board would consider disbursement freezes, reassignment of remaining management roles, and possible civil liability. Heather stood up too fast. The sunglasses finally slipped down her nose. Her eyes were red. She said, "You'll be alone when it's over. You know that, right?" I didn't answer. Because I wasn't alone. And I wasn't finished. After the meeting, I didn't go straight home. I walked for blocks, past offices and closed storefronts and yellow cabs slipping through intersections like they had somewhere better to be. I stopped at a cafe and ordered tea. Sat by the window. Pulled out my phone. There was a message waiting from an old friend of my grandfather's. A man named Daniel who used to run the local credit union and had once taught me the difference between being smart and being strategic. He'd heard about the audit. Wanted to talk. We met that weekend in a quiet corner booth. He was older now, slower, but his eyes were still sharp. He said, "Harold would be proud of what you're doing." I replied, "I'm not doing it for pride." He nodded, "That's why he'd be proud." I told him about the trust's vulnerabilities. The loopholes. The long years where no one asked questions because everyone assumed proximity to power meant permission. He told me something then, something I hadn't known. Before my grandfather passed, he'd tried to revise the trust structure. Tried to appoint me formally, not just as successor, but as administrator. But the documents were delayed. Contested. Stalled by the very people who were now sitting across mediation tables pretending not to know how the money disappeared. Daniel said, he saw it coming. Just not how fast. I went home that night with more than paperwork. I went home with purpose. Not revenge. Correction. I spent the next week working with an estate law firm to finalize the restructure my grandfather never finished. With the audit results in hand, and the board's preliminary recommendations, I had leverage to push the revisions through. We reorganized asset oversight. Reassigned the remaining rental management to a third-party firm. Drafted a clause to permanently bar anyone involved in the audit from holding decision-making authority. It was surgical. Unemotional. Absolute. 2 weeks later, the final document was signed and sealed. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like relief. Like the quiet after a long, cold storm. But even then, I knew something was coming. Because people like my mother don't vanish. They wait. And sure enough, one morning, as I stepped into the lobby of my office building, there she was. Waiting. Pearls. Silk. Smile like nothing ever broke. She said, "I thought we could talk." I looked at her. At the woman who had taught me how to smile through dishonesty. How to twist guilt into leverage. How to make cruelty sound like concern. I said, "You're trespassing." Then I walked past her, into the elevator. And as the doors closed between us, her expression shifted, not to rage. Not to sadness. To something worse. Recognition. She finally saw me clearly. And for once, she had nothing left to say. Some endings don't explode. They just stop answering the phone. After that encounter in the lobby, my mother didn't try again. No texts. No sudden appearances. No forced letters trying to reframe everything as a misunderstanding. It was like she'd finally accepted that the performance was over, and the audience, me, had left the theater. The audit findings became public within the trust community 2 weeks later. Nothing dramatic. Just a circulated bulletin among fiduciary administrators noting mismanagement, recommendations for asset protection, and the permanent barring of Richard and Patricia Hamilton from future control or advisory positions. Their names. In print. In the exact kind of world where reputation carries weight. I didn't share it with anyone. But I kept a copy. Meanwhile, Heather's silence stretched louder than my mother's ever could. There was no apology, no defense, just disappearance. Her family photos vanished from social media. Her children's names removed from caption posts. She was retreating, managing the narrative behind closed doors, blaming me to anyone who'd still listen. I let her. Sometimes dignity isn't in the confrontation. It's in the refusal to participate. Still, there were consequences. Always are. A former client of my father's, someone who'd invested in a side project under the illusion of family trust, filed a civil claim. He'd learned about the audit through a shared contact, realized where some of his missing money had likely gone, and decided to act. I wasn't involved in that case. But I followed it. Quietly. The suit never made headlines, but it cost them. Settlement fees. Legal stress. Public embarrassment in their shrinking social circle. They couldn't tie it to me directly. But they knew. And then came the foreclosure notice. The lake house. The one they always described as part of our legacy, though I'd only been invited there twice in my adult life, both times to take pictures that made them look generous. It went up for auction 6 months after the trust restructure. A friend in real estate forwarded me the listing. Nathan said, "Do you want it?" I replied, "No. Let someone else write their own memories into it." Instead, I bought a different property. A quiet, wooded cabin on the edge of the Adirondacks. Small. Minimalist. Completely mine. It wasn't for revenge. It was for stillness. I went up alone the first weekend after closing. Packed a bag. Left my phone turned off for 72 hours. Sat on the porch with a book and a sweater and a mug of tea that went cold while I listened to nothing but trees swaying like old whispers. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not joy. Not peace. Just weightlessness. The absence of responsibility that was never mine to carry. When I returned to the city, I did what I'd been putting off. I called the estate attorney and asked to finalize the final trust report. It was ready, just waiting for my signature. I read through it slowly that night, page by page, highlighting a few details, underlining numbers that had once meant more than they should have. Then I signed. The trust was closed. Fully distributed. Accounted for. No loose threads. And that should have been the end. But endings, I've learned, come in layers. A few days later, I received a card in the mail. No return address. Just my name. In my mother's handwriting. Inside was a folded photo of me as a child, maybe 7 years old, standing in front of the house on Greenfield Avenue, holding a birthday balloon and wearing a paper crown. Taped to the photo was a note. It said, "You always wanted too much." I held the photo for a long time. Not because it hurt. Because it didn't. It felt like watching a magician repeat the same trick long after everyone else had stopped clapping. I didn't respond. I shredded the note. Kept the photo. Not as a keepsake. As a reminder. That some people will only ever know love as a currency. And that refusing to pay no longer made me the villain. In the months that followed, I shifted focus entirely. I pulled back from certain clients, started mentoring junior associates, poured time into building something slower, more meaningful. I even started writing again, essays mostly, under a pen name. Nothing published. Just reflections on boundaries, legacy, and the difference between inheritance and identity. One night, Nathan found a few pages on the printer. He didn't say much. Just handed them to me with a raised brow. He said, "You sound like someone who's telling the truth." I replied, "It only took 30 years. He smiled and left the pages on my desk, uncrumpled. We never spoke of it again. That fall, I returned to the cabin alone one more time. The trees had turned to fire, orange and gold and deep blood red. The air carried the smell of endings. I stood barefoot on the wooden porch and watched the last light slip behind the trees like it didn't owe anyone an explanation. And I realized something then, quietly, with no epiphany or grand conclusion. Some wounds don't scar. Some just vanish when you stop picking at them. But healing doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes, it looks like shutting the door. And never checking to see if anyone knocked again. The strangest part about reclaiming your life is realizing how quiet it gets once the fighting stops. Not empty, just quiet. Like the air after a long thunderstorm, when everything is damp and still, and you can finally hear your own breathing again. I stayed at the cabin through the first frost. There was no grand decision to do it. I didn't pack with finality or make it symbolic. I just kept pushing my return date further and further back until one day I realized I hadn't left at all. The city felt too loud. Too built for performance. I needed stillness, and the trees didn't ask questions. I woke early. Made coffee on a stovetop kettle. Wrote by hand in spiral notebooks. Read old essays I used to rush through in college, trying to find pieces of myself I hadn't known to look for. I didn't speak to anyone for 3 full days once. And nothing inside me panicked. That was how I knew I was healing. It didn't look like confidence or joy or even clarity. It looked like eating a meal alone and not needing to document it. Like watching snow fall and not reaching for my phone. Like thinking of my mother and feeling nothing sharp. Just space. Back in the city, Nathan held things down. He didn't pressure me to return. He sent short texts, photos of the cat we'd talked about adopting but hadn't yet. A grocery list he was proud of. A blurry photo of the sunset from our balcony, captioned simply, "Thought of you." No guilt. No need. Just presence. When I finally drove back to the apartment that winter, I stood at the door for a full minute before unlocking it. The air smelled like him. And cinnamon. There was a note on the counter. He wrote, "Welcome back to whatever version of yourself you brought with you. I've missed all of them." I sat down and cried for the first time in months. Not the hot tears of rage or the dry ones of fatigue. The soft kind. The ones that make you realize how heavy the armor was once you've finally put it down. I didn't call my parents. I didn't reach out to Heather. I didn't check their social media, or Google their names, or ask anyone about them. I let them live in whatever narrative they needed to. Because the truth didn't need defending anymore. It just needed living. The trust funds I'd restructured were now being handled by an independent management group. Clean. Transparent. Built for future beneficiaries who'd never know my name, and didn't need to. That was the legacy I wanted. Not inheritance. Integrity. One night, Nathan and I took a walk near the river. The wind bit at our cheeks, and he handed me a thermos of cocoa he'd made before we left. He said, "You're lighter." I replied, "I stopped auditioning." He nodded. I don't think he needed me to explain. In the spring, I submitted an essay under my real name for the first time. It was about boundaries. About quiet estrangement. About the difference between protecting your peace and abandoning your past. The editor wrote back the same day. They published it in a small literary journal. No comments. No bylines screaming for attention. Just my words, nestled among others, doing what they were meant to do, speak, then let go. A few months later, I received a letter from a woman in Maine. She'd read the piece, recognized herself in it. Her handwriting trembled through the page. She wrote, "I didn't know someone else felt like this. Thank you for naming it." I folded her letter and kept it in a drawer, beside my old passport and a bundle of postcards I never mailed. Maybe one day I'll write her back. Maybe I won't need to. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't always look like rebuilding. Sometimes, it's the decision not to carry the fire into the next room. Sometimes, it's not saying everything you could have. Just standing at the edge of what burned and choosing not to step back into the smoke. I visit the cabin once a month now. Nathan joins me sometimes. Other times, I go alone. Last week, I planted 2 small trees on the ridge. Not because I needed the symbolism. But because I wanted shade. Something for later. Something I might not even sit under. But someone will. And maybe that's enough. Maybe, in the end, this is what peace actually looks like. Not silence. Not surrender. Just the soft, final sound of a door closing. And no one on the other side to stop you.